And why would the government be against that unless they're too scared to have their shibboleths exposed to the light of day?
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to oppose the bill. Mr. Speaker, I suppose the first point I would make is that the member's rhetoric is somewhat extravagant compared to the content of the bill. We heard a lot about shibboleths, ideology, extreme monetarism. I've got a list. And the fact you would think from that, socialism, well, he didn't, Fabian's socialist. No, that wasn't used, actually. But it could have been. It could have been. But the member used quite extravagant rhetoric, which would lead you to believe that what was proposed in this bill was some radically new vision of monetary policy. But of course it wasn't, actually. It wasn't. This bill is a variation, represents a variation on the monetary policy framework, which just happens to be one that can't work. But it's not something completely different. And I'll just read out for the benefit of the House what the member is actually proposing. The new Section 8 provides that the primary function of the Reserve Bank is to formulate, this is in the clause-by-clause analysis, to formulate and implement monetary policy directed to the economic objective of maintaining stability in the general level of prices. So for all his abuse about inflation targeting, actually this bill includes inflation targeting. Because that just simply reflects it's possible he hasn't read it. And then it says, while maintaining an exchange rate that is conducive to real export growth and job creation. That's the other objective. Now, Mr. Speaker, so in the first place, we're not talking here about some radically different view. We're actually talking here about a proposition which is that somehow you can use the Reserve Bank interest rate mechanism to lower the exchange rate, or I presume raise it if they thought that was conducive. And Mr. Speaker, that is simply not the case. You just can't do that. You just can't do that. Mr. Speaker, what we did hear from the member proposing this bill, alongside the extravagant rhetoric, is the illusion he has long held out to audiences around the country over 30 years that there's some kind of free lunch to be had if only the mandarins in the Reserve Bank would decide to grow the economy. That somehow it'll just magically appear that growth in the economy doesn't depend on how well you run your business. It doesn't depend on how skilled the workforce is that you work with on the shop floor. That it doesn't depend on the state of the markets to which you're selling. That actually growth in the economy depends on the Reserve Bank governor choosing it. The Greens suffer from the same illusion, and both of them have taken over what used to be some common sense in the Labor Party and have now turned them into a bunch of illusionists as well. That there's a free lunch to be had if only the governor of the Reserve Bank would decide tired old orthodoxy. Well, it happens to be the orthodoxy that's come from 30 years of inflation targeting across the Western world. That's where it comes from. That's where it comes from. Left behind. Well, at least the former member for Tauranga has come up with a proposition. The Labor Party haven't. The Labor Party have just said there's a free lunch to be had, but we're not going to tell you how you can get it for free. Winston Peters has said there's a free lunch to be had, and how you get it is you target the exchange rate as well as inflation. Well, at least he's put up a proposition. I'd agree with that. Now, Mr. Speaker, it happens to be a proposition that doesn't work. That's the point. It just happens to be a proposition that doesn't work. In fact, one thing that's become reasonably clear, if you look at how Reserve Bank monetary policy frameworks are specified around the world, what you will find is that they all amount to inflation targeting. The Federal Reserve mandate is written a bit differently than ours. The Reserve Bank of Australia framework is written a bit differently than ours. But what is pretty clear is that all governors of reserve banks make similar types of decisions for similar reasons. What every governor of any of those reserve banks will tell you is that they cannot substitute monetary policy decisions for real effects in the economy. That is, if your economy is getting less competitive, nothing the Reserve Bank does can change that. If your economy is getting more competitive, nothing the Reserve Bank can do will change that. And that's the illusion that is embodied in this piece of legislation, that somehow the way the Reserve Bank makes its decisions about interest rates is going to have an impact on how skilled a workforce is, or that somehow the way the Governor of the Reserve Bank makes this decision about interest rates is going to make the genetic stock of New Zealand's farming capacity higher quality. Well, it isn't. It isn't. It doesn't matter how you specify the monetary policy framework, the key to generating incomes and creating jobs is the competitiveness and the productivity of our businesses. There is no free lunch, and that is where the opposition parties have got out of touch, not just with the analysis, but also with public opinion. Voters in New Zealand, Australia, Europe and the USA have never been more awake to snake oil than they are now. They've never been more awake to snake oil than they are now, because they have learnt the hard lesson. And the hard lesson of the developed world is that politicians who promise you free stuff in the end had to borrow the money for it, and eventually you've borrowed too much and you have to pay it back. That is, and the public understand that. And they also understand that when people come along saying we've got to print money, that's the way out, they know that spells future danger, and they know you only do that in extreme circumstances. And when someone comes along and tells you they are going to set the exchange rate, that is a gambler in the casino of international financial markets. And that is what this bill is about. This bill is about saying the New Zealand taxpayer, via the Reserve Bank, should start gambling in the casino of international financial markets. And I thought that's what Winston Peters was against, not what he was for. And if he's trying to force the exchange rate down, do his voters and Labor's voters and Green voters understand that means forcing their standard of living down and their cost of living up? I thought that's what they were against. So, Mr. Speaker, the bill isn't the radical revolution it is made out to be. It's simply a way of operating monetary policy that can't work, and it operates against the interests of the supporters of the parties proposing it, which tells me they just don't understand this. They just don't understand what they're advocating. We do. It won't work. Inflation targeting is a well-established method right across the developed world that's had at least 30 years of testing and trial, and we support the current regime, and that is why we're voting against this.
The Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, the problem for the National Party is that they've painted themselves into another corner.